So we begin every interview with some basic biographical information. So can you tell me your full name, your date and place of birth, and your current status, please?
My name is Donald Sutherland. I was born on September 10th, 1943 in Ottawa, Canada. I now live in the United States. Almost Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland. I'm going to retire at the end of this year.
Okay, lucky you. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, your upbringing, your education, that sort of thing?
That's kind of hard to say. I was brought up in Ottawa and left in 1965 to go to England at the University of Sussex because it had a reputation in those days of being extraordinarily radical and innovative from the historiographical point of view. And that turned out to be not a disappointment by any means. It was a very exciting place to be. And then I realized that I was only 30 miles from the French archives, so if I went back to the United States or Canada, it was several thousand miles away from the archives. So I went up to the University of London, had an interview with Alfred Cobbin, which lasted about half an hour, and he invited me to a seminar the following October. So I did my PhD at the University of London.
Okay. And before we get to 1968, etc., would you describe yourself as being politically active in any way, shape, or form when you were younger, before 1968?
Well, Canadian citizens could vote in the UK in those days. It was all part of the aftermath of empire. So I was quite active in some of the Labour Party movement in the mid 1960s, in the sense that there was a very important by-election that took place in Brighton that was very important for the Labour Party to hold its majority in the House of Commons. So I agitated in Kemptown. I think it was Kemptown, not sure. Eastern half of Brighton, not the Tory half. And I was active there, but I was never active in France at all. I didn't feel that was my place.
Okay, and when you were younger, in your family, for example, was politics a big deal, or was it just not talked about?
It was talked about in a kind of standard, but my parents were not politically committed. They were different. Different politically. My father was a supporter of the Canadian Liberal Party, and my mother was a supporter of the Canadian Socialists, known as the NDP. But they didn't talk about or dispute much. They just went out and vote. Occasional discussions at the dinner table, that sort of thing. Nothing very active.
Okay, so what was your status in 1968, and what brought you to France in '68?
Well, I was in France to do research on my thesis for the University of London, which was about the Chouans, the counter-revolutionary peasant guerrillas that opposed the revolution. And so I went to Brittany to study there, and went to Rennes, which had a very good archive. And it was not my first sojourn in the archives there, but it was pretty close to it. And I walked into the May '68 revolution and experienced it from the provinces, which is a kind of unique perspective. It was not in Paris. Rennes was not particularly active. It was, if anything, it showed its conservative nature in those days. I think it's changed since. Much more militant left now than it was. And the biggest demonstration that took place in May '68 in London was a right-wing pro-Gaullist demonstration on the Place de la Mairie, which I witnessed. And but the interesting part about that, it was a coalition. I found out later from some of my royalist friends that demonstration was the largest demonstration in May '68 in Brittany. But it was a coalition of right-wing groups, that is to say, which is not apparent at the time. That coalition consisted of pro-Gaullist demonstrators plus royalists. The royalists were largely hidden. And the royalists normally hated de Gaulle because he liberated Algeria, gave Algeria its independence. But this was opportunism on their part. They thought it was better to support de Gaulle than it was to support a communist takeover of the country, which is how they saw it. So I got that from some of my royalist friends that I met later. Doing a counter-revolutionary topic, I got to meet a number of aristocratic families who still survive in Brittany.
Okay, very good. And was this your first extended period in France?
No, the first extended period in France was 1966, where I spent several weeks. But I actually was domiciled in London and used to commute either by ferry or by cheap airfare from someplace in Kent to the Touquet Airport, and then a train, a little two-car passenger train to Paris, and then take the train from Gare Montparnasse out to Rennes. Much longer than it is now. It's about 2 hours on the TGV to go from Paris to Rennes. Now, I think in those days it was like 6 or 7. A very long journey. And then I stayed in the student residences when I was there.
And where were you staying when you went in '68? Were you staying
in '68? I was staying at the Hotel Le Pingouin, which was a small, cheap hotel that only graduate students could afford, in the center of Rennes. I walked around a lot.
And how long were you in France for? Were you there for the year?
No, I was there for weeks at a time. As I said, stay a maximum of 4 or 6 weeks, something like that. Then I would go back to London, where I lived for a while. I lived in Whitechapel. Then the rest of the time I lived in Highgate. So I moved halfway through to move to Highgate, and then would commute.
And when you were there, what did you make of life in France? Did you feel it was particularly different to what you'd experienced back home? Was there any sign that anything was going to kick off, or did the events come?
There was no sign whatsoever that it was going to kick off, that the revolution was going to occur. When the student demonstrations took place in Paris, everybody in my circle was pretty sympathetic. I was quite enthusiastic about the whole thing, because the demand for university reform in the 1960s was common to both sides of the Atlantic. And we felt as undergraduates to be particularly stifled in the kind of teaching we got and the way the university administration treated us. So when a similar movement broke out in France, I think we were all very enthusiastic and sympathetic. And then even more sympathetic with the government's response, which was brutal towards the students, with the CRS beating people over the head. And so when the workers joined, it appeared to be a new dawn bursting on France. I was very enthusiastic about the whole movement.
Yeah. And had you had any experience with the French university system, or were you completely?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
I used to stay occasionally at the student residence at the Cité Universitaire, and I met a few students at the Salon. It was opposite the archives, just en face. Met some students there, and met students in the archives who were doing similar kind of topics and so on. But the connection was very ephemeral.
Yeah, so there was no real sense of any frustration that was building within the university milieu at that time.
Not that I knew directly, only what I read in the press later.
Yeah, and one of the things that is often discussed in terms of the context of the time is the international context. So that there was some degree of upheaval taking place almost all over the world. Was there anything in particular, any sense that that international issues were having an impact in France at the time, or did you think they were completely?
Well, the Vietnam War was a big motivating factor among the students. I think they were very hostile to the American intervention in Vietnam. In terms of international student solidarity, there's an awareness of what was going on in Berkeley and places like that. But an awareness, I don't think there was any contact that I knew of. And then there was some sympathy with some of the very, I think in retrospect, minor manifestations of student discontent at the London School of Economics, which, despite its background, socialist background, was a very privileged place. Faculty had separate elevators, which even when I used to go study there at the library, thought that this is a bit much given its socialist background. It's not very egalitarian to have special lifts for faculty. Yeah. And then the largest demonstration in London was at the London Art School, which was in Highgate. I think the students were very radical, but the rest of the University of London, not so much.
So in your experience is actually quite strange, because you're kind of between two places, at the same time, which is interesting because one of the things that I've asked people is to reflect on what it was like to be a foreign student it at this time in these very exceptional events? I mean, was it more difficult? Did you feel as though you could participate, or did you just?
I didn't feel I could participate. I feel I could witness, wander among the crowds, listen to what people were saying. It was not at all a sense of, there was no real sense of menace whatsoever. And you could talk to students and listen and participate in some of the demonstrations, or at least witness some of the demonstrations. But aside from that, no. There's I'm thinking this over about how I approached May '68 in Brittany. Is I think I saw it through what I understood revolutions to be at that time, which was 1789, and the great influence then was the historiography of Georges Lefebvre. And that meant that you had to pay attention to the food supply and to communications. And the food supply was never in doubt, so that was different than 1789. Whatever the strikes were, the SNCF and the trucking companies kept functioning, more or less. I think they were on strike partially, but never fully. So the food supply was not a problem, and the other was the role of rumor. And there were lots of rumors in May '68, but more or less contained, because the communications didn't break down. The TV sort of kept going, the ORTF sort of kept going, but what kept going constantly was the radio. And I think the fact that the radio did not go on strike kept the country on an even keel, because reliable information was coming from Paris and people could evaluate it for themselves. We listened. My experience in the archives in that roughly 6 weeks from early May to middle of June, when de Gaulle gave his second speech, was my memory is that we did nothing did no archive work whatsoever, but listened to the radio constantly for news, and that kept the panic lid on.
I mean, a broader question, and perhaps at this time, well, and with hindsight, this is very easy, but we talk about this sense that French society and perhaps European society more generally is going through rapid change and development, and this manifests itself in what some people have described as a generation clash. And this may have been obvious through things like fashion, music, politics. Was there any sense that there was a generation clash in your experience, or did you not see that?
I think there was the slogan from May '68 was "Never trust anybody under 30." So there was that sense of a generational difference, and I think a sense also that very rapid social change was making a difference to young people. For young people, it was a time of tremendous opportunity. The 1960s were extraordinarily easy to find a job in the academic world. And when I first went to France, actually the UK was the same. There were poor countries in what I was in comparison to Canada. That the East End of London was nothing like what it is nowadays. It's hard to imagine how poor East of London is, or was in those days. And France, when you took the train from Boulogne or Calais into Paris, you saw peasants cultivating their fields without tractors, with horses and plows. So it was primitive technologically. It was moving very fast. A lot of building going on, and as I say, a lot of opportunity for young people. So a sense that the world was changing rapidly in favor of young people and in favor of new ideas.
Okay, that's good. So can you recall how you started to sense that something was happening? How did this begin to manifest itself?
I think the stages, that would be the student movement in Paris, demanding autonomy for the university and democratic control of university institutions, which I understood immediately. I mean, I felt that the same way about my experience in Canada, that students were ignored in the great scheme of things. So there was a sense almost from the beginning that something different was happening. And then when de Gaulle's government intervened with a crackdown, we understood something very special was happening that wasn't occurring elsewhere. So I think almost from the beginning, I had a sense that these were unique events.
And so how did this play out for you on a daily basis? Did you stay in the Rennes? Did you get involved? Did you go to Paris?
I went to the archives.
Archives didn't close?
No, well, I think we're all dedicated, including the French students, are dedicated to getting our theses done. And the archives were going to go on strike, and we the readers, persuaded them not to. They agreed to stay open for us. But as I say, we didn't do much for our dissertations. We listened to the radio the entire time. That's my recollection. We just listened to the radio. Great way of improving my French also on a daily basis. There's a solidarity among the small little readers of the Archives départementales d'Ille-et-Vilaine. That was a solidarity that I felt. Not so much for the students across the street.
Okay, so you didn't feel any solidarity with the students?
In a sort of moral sense, yeah, but not in a political sense that I joined anything.
Yeah. And was there anything going on in the university that you were able to see or participate in?
I think the university was pretty quiet, unless my memory is completely faulty here. I think the what became the Université de Haute-Bretagne was a fairly quiet place. I think there were greater agitations in Brest and Nantes, which is part of the tradition of Breton politics anyway.
Yeah.
Nantes is the far more active of the two big cities.
And did you travel anywhere, or did you stay in Rennes the whole time? No desire to go and see Paris?
I wasn't even sure I'd be able to get back. Whether the SNCF would be still functioning. I went to Saint-Malo for the heck of it, and the rest of the time I spent in Salon, partly with some American friends, especially John Hurt, who has just recently retired from the University of Delaware. John had a car, and he said that if things ever get really bad, he had enough gas to get us to Brussels. So we had an escape hatch.
John was interviewed for this as well, and
I gather.
that as well.
Yeah,
exactly the same thing. What are the big standout moments for you in your memory? What are the things that stick out for you?
One is the big right-wing demonstration in favor of de Gaulle.
That must have been right at the end of May, no?
Right at the end of May. I think that was the end of May. Yeah, it would have been the end of May. And the other would be de Gaulle's second speech, where, again, as radio listeners, we all heard about the speculation involved that he had gone to Germany to speak to General Massu. And this was supposed to be a secret, but it was obviously a leak designed to influence public opinion. And no one knew. De Gaulle had apparently, in quotation marks, disappeared for 3 days. But in fact, everybody speculated he was with the French NATO troops in Germany and he was making a deal with the army. And the deal that people speculated was that there would be a pardon for the OAS plotters who were all in favor of Algérie française in the early 1960s. There'd be an amnesty for them if the army would back the regime. I don't know whether that's true. I can't remember whether that ever occurred or not, but that was what was being said. And then de Gaulle came back with that kind of reinforcement and gave a second speech on the radio, which was extremely forceful, unlike his previous discussions on the radio, which have been very weak and badly received. This one was very forceful and very insistent that there be a return to public order, and he called legislative elections. And the feeling was that once we heard that speech, it was over. The feeling was definitely over. It didn't require physical force in any way. My other memory is my contribution to the revolution I was walking from the Hôtel Le Pingouin to the archives and crossing the Place Hoche, and I was stopped by a young man in a half-track military vehicle who asked me the direction to Paris. And that was one of the rumors that we always heard in the archives also, that troops were being moved from the bases in Lower Brittany to Paris. And people swore they had seen big trucks going through, not through Rennes, but around Rennes. And this young man was obviously lost. He asked me for the direction to Paris, so I sat on the bus. So that was my little bit of subversion.
Very good. What about the sort of day-to-day in Rennes? Was it difficult? Were the sort of banks closed, petrol stations,
food supply?
Food supply, I think, as I recall, the grocery was functioning. The Cité Universitaire, where we had lunch, you could buy lunch at just a few francs a pop, were open intermittently. There was never a problem of finding a place to go and find some food. The grocery stores and the supermarché were open occasionally. You could cook. Some of my favorite restaurants were open. No, I don't think there's ever a problem. That was one of the lessons of applying 1789 to 1968, is that 1789 is a far more severe situation from the point of view of food supply, which I would be trained to look for. This is the key to where revolutions really take off, and it didn't really happen in the end anyway.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some more specific questions. And feel free to say you've no opinion on this.
Sure.
So one of the interesting debates around 1968 centers on the question of contact between students and workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you had any experience of that, or did you hear any talk of that, or had you anything to say about that?
Just that when it happened, people knew something amazing had happened. The workers going out on strike against the violence directed against the students, we all knew that that was a very special turning point. But aside from that, I don't know anything that anybody doesn't know already. Nothing special.
Yeah, but how did that feel when the workers then came in? Did that make it feel as though it had moved up?
Well, it made it very exciting. I mean, the whole promise of 1968 is that the world is going to turn on a kind of pivot, and the materialism of the 1960s of the post-war was going to end in something more glorious. And the feeling was autonomy for students and for workers, autogestion, one of the slogans of 1968, that things would be very different, to be more democratic control of the means of production. And the tyranny of the political class and the patronat would come to an end. So this would be a socialist revolution, but not a communist one. By no means a communist one. As you know, students in May 68 thought the communists were stodgy and part of the establishment.
Another interesting characteristic often associated with 68 is this idea of la prise de parole, this idea that suddenly everyone was speaking to each other and there were debates happening everywhere. Did you have any experience of that? Or?
Not really, and just the usual. Berlin is in ville froide. I mean, this is what they used to say about themselves, that it was a cold city and not very welcoming. And I think as a foreigner with an accent speaking French, I sort of didn't feel a part of daily life particularly. You have to talk to someone else, some of the students involved who were there, see how they felt about it.
Yeah, no problem. When you look back on this period, do you consider it correct to describe 1968 as a violent moment?
Not at all. Not at all. It's a remarkable revolution that so few people were injured. There were some deaths, and I think the police were responsible for some fatalities due to their own stupidity. Or, on the whole, the French police were very well trained in dealing with demonstrations of this sort, especially the CRS, which was designed as a strike-breaking force, and they actually didn't exercise their brutality by way of killing people or wounding them, and just injured them. And I think that probably saved May 68 from becoming much more violent than it was. The students themselves, of course, were not armed, and nor was any desire to go and seek out arms. That's different from Paris in 1789, where this desire to get arms is immediate. But in May 68, not at all. So I would say not at all a violent movement, particularly as these things go.
So when you were hearing radio reports of, say, the La Nuit des Barricades or clashes between the CRS and students in Paris, was there not a fear that it was becoming increasingly violent, or did it never feel?
I'm sorry, Chris. When you said violent, I was thinking killing.
No, violence.
Of course, it was violent in that respect, of the building the barricades through paving stones and cars, other equipment that they could find, and the police trying to break those down. That part was violent. The part that is important to remember is the uncertainty of that. That's my recollection as a person in the provinces where things are happening outside your sphere, happening a couple hundred miles away in Paris. And this is something that was going to happen to you, but you had no control over it. And so it was going to be decided in Paris and not by anything you could do whatsoever. The only thing you could do was flee if it got that bad.
Did you have any experience of seeing the CRS or the riot police in Rennes, or
Nope.
none?
No, not at all. We saw regular police, but it wasn't wasn't particularly notable for the number of police on the street or anything like that. I have no memory of a very strong police presence.
Okay, so just lost soldiers.
Just lost soldiers and one. he might have had he may have had his mates inside that armored personnel carrier, but he had stuck out the hole.
All right.
That's all I saw. And he's only about 19 years old. There's still a conscript army.
Yeah.
So it was like talking to a teenager. In fact, I was talking to a teenager.
Yeah. You've mentioned there, and I'm personally very interested in the regional dimension of 1968 and the necessity to maybe get beyond just looking at Paris and consider what's happened elsewhere in Brittany or elsewhere. And I'm interested in the dynamic that you've described between what it felt like in the provinces and what was happening in Paris. So was there a feeling that what was happening elsewhere was in reaction to Paris, or was there a sense that there were regional concerns or regional demands?
There were regional concerns in Brittany at the time, especially a question of autonomy and how dirigiste the regime in Paris was vis-a-vis Breton autonomy, sort of the idea that the government simply had too big a control over Breton lives. But that preceded May 68 and succeeded May 68 as a continuing matter. I did have some contact in the late 1960s with genuine separatists whose purpose was, this is very hard to believe, Brittany was to separate to form part of the Celtic nation, which would be the reunification of Ireland, Cornwall, and Scotland in one single nation by themselves. That was their ultimate goal. And they thought that since I did counter-revolutionary movements which are hostile to the metropole, that I must be one of them. So I had an entree into some very esoteric politics. And because of my Scottish background, Scottish surname, they thought I must have been part of the movement. But I was simply amazed, actually, more than anything else, simply dumbstruck about the extraordinary ambitions of the Breton separatists.
Yeah. So would you say that your feeling at the time was that this was a Parisian revolt, or was it more, or was it?
Well, it couldn't have been, because you were in that Upper Brittany, I think, was pretty quiescent. But there were movements around Nantes, which I think student movement in Nantes was pretty active. And then there were working class sit-ins at Stud Aviation, which had a big plant outside Nantes. So that was a part of it. But how you integrate that into a general picture, which I've tried to do in my work on the revolution, integrate the provinces with Paris. It's still a blank for me in how to do that for May 68.
Okay. So moving even further afield, was there any sense at the time that what was happening in France was linked to some sort of international wave of revolt, which, with hindsight, it's clear that there are many commonalities between what was happening in France and what was happening elsewhere. Was there any sense of this at the time?
I think we were aware of it, that the student movement was international in the sense it was taking place in different countries. And student movement in Germany was pretty active. Some activities in London, and of course the American anti-Vietnam War movement was very huge. So I think there's a sense of commonality there. A sense of commonality that there should be democratic control of universities. I think that was pretty common. That's as far as I can go, though, with that question.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Again, your kind of experience of being in two places at once must have been very interesting, though, to see, what's happening in England and then coming over to France and seeing that maybe there were similar demands.
Yeah, I think, well, with the University of London, there was certainly probably was a need for some kind of decentralization and democratic control because it was and remains, I think, a kind of behemoth, especially Senate House. It has a great deal of authority over the rest of the university to no real purpose that I can see. Can't see now, couldn't see then. The colleges like University College, where I was enrolled, was a very welcoming place in that respect. It was not a distant or cold or anything like that. They were extraordinarily helpful, providing me office space when I needed it, and calculators. In other words, adding machines that you pulled with a crank for my research. They were very good, but a lot of the University of London was very huge and distant.
Yeah. Okay. You've already talked a bit about de Gaulle in '68, but what was your general impression of the way in which the political elite had handled the situation?
Very badly. Very badly. I think there was an immediate reaction that student voice deserved not to be heard. And that the only way to handle it is the way they handled strikes on the part of workers, which is to beat it down. There's no sense of negotiating or suppleness with regard to the student demands, which were, after all, I think fairly reasonable. I think they're reasonable now, and they were reasonable then for a decentralized structure inside the university. So I think if May '68 got out of hand, it was because of repression.
Okay. And what did you think of the performance of the Communist Party or Mitterrand or Mendes France people on the left?
Communist Party, I think, was held in contempt by the student movement. They were really out of touch. The socialist unions were more or less the same. They couldn't cope with the idea of democratic control and the means of production, which is a lot autogestion, which a lot of the working movement was about. That was beyond them, and they used the strikes to negotiate a giant pay raise, which is a way of deflecting. At least that was the feeling from the students' point of view, that they were deflecting the workers' movement and co-opting the workers' movement onto separating them from the student movement. So the socialist, Mendes France, I think, was always held in great sympathy. Mitterrand, I can't answer your question. I have no real memory of what he was up to in those days. The socialists, so the communists were held in contempt. The socialists a little less so.
Okay. So when things are brought to a conclusion in June 1968, when the Gaullists win the legislative elections that de Gaulle calls for, what was your sense? Was it one of disappointment or was it one of relief?
To some degree, relief, but I'll talk about that later. But I thought that the movement would go on, that with the legislative elections and so on, that once the movement started, especially in the universities, was going to continue, and maybe to some extent it did, but it soon petered out as an organized movement, the pressure movement. I think May '68 had a huge influence on French intellectuals, but that wasn't evident at the time. There was a more long-term how they affected intellectuals in the arts and thinking among the humanities. But that had a huge effect in that respect. But in terms of structures of the university, perhaps not so much, despite all the complaining that's gone on since. But how '68 ruined the French university, I don't think that's true. But in many respects, the May '68's, to answer your question, I was very optimistic that things would continue. But they didn't. And in that sense, May '68 was a failure because the idea of democratic control never did take hold.
Okay. So why were you relieved?
Relieved because revolutions are scary things. When society breaks down and 95% of your life is under threat, that the routines that you expect are going to occur and don't occur, and you can't be certain that life is going to be the same in 10 minutes that it is just now. It's exhilarating, I think, when you're 22 years old, which I was at the time. I think that's pretty exhilarating. At the same time, just the uncertainty of it is a little bit scary at the same time.
And what about your friends or your family back home? How did they feel about you being in Paris at this time?
My parents were not in the least worried. Not in the least worried. I'm not sure whether that was how it was covered in the Canadian press. Perhaps it was represented as fairly benign. But I'd have to consult my letters. I still have all my letters from my parents. I'd have to consult them. But I don't remember them being at all nervous.
Okay. And so what did you do? How long did you stay in France for then? Did you stay into the summer in France as well?
Into the summer.
And then did you go back for the start of the academic year, 68, 69 then? Or?
I probably went back sooner than that, although I can't recall.
Okay, so we'll open it up a little bit then to, and you've mentioned there some of the consequences. I mean, how did you perceive the impact of these events on France at the time? So you've already mentioned some of the impact on the university world, but how do you see the consequences perhaps more broadly and perhaps in a more long-term perspective?
It's one of those revolutions in France that doesn't have big long-term consequences, it seems to me. And if you're defining it the way I'm defining it, as this democratic control, that hasn't occurred either in the workplace or in the universities, and it's unlikely that it's going to occur in the foreseeable future. So in that respect, it was a huge, exciting, wonderful time which was very creative, very exciting to be a part of, but which petered out.
So you don't see any real long-term consequences for France of 68?
No, not really. Not really.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Do you think that your experience of France in 1968 had any influence on the way you understand France?
That's so hard to say. My relationship with France is kind of ongoing. When I first went in 1966, it was a very strange place with a strange language and strange people, and physically different to look at, and the architecture was different, the cars were different, the people were different, they dressed different, all that. And having gone now for 50 years, you get more used to it. I like it more and more. I adore going to France. The relationship is deeper. I have many more friends who I'm very anxious to see. We're on Facebook all the time. So the relationship is a lot warmer and more intimate now than it was in the 1960s.
Did your experience of 1968 make you want to go back, or did it?
Oh yes, absolutely. Because there was this feeling that exciting things were happening in France. That France was an exciting place to be. It wasn't. It was scary, as I say, but it wasn't scary in the sense of being repulsed.
Mm-hmm.
Apprehensive, I guess, might be a better word.
Okay. So would you say that the events and your experience of them had any impact on you personally / politically?
I kept my loyalty to the Labour Party. Ever being profoundly disappointed when Labour lost the 1970 election. Very extremely disappointed. I was on the verge of my returning to Canada for my first job. But it didn't alter my politics in any way. It's made it a different perspective.
But did it confirm your politics, do you think?
It convinced me of the possibility of a different kind of world, yeah. Yeah, I think so. That's possible.
Do you think quite a lot of people who I've spoken to talk about how they were able to take some of the ideas of their experience and bring that with them when they did go back home, whether it was back to the States or back to England or back to wherever. They felt as though they'd learned something during their time in France and put that into practice when they came back. Did that?
I honestly don't know how to answer that. It's a kind of what if, if it hadn't happened, would things be different? Hard to say. I think it confirmed the trajectory I was already on, and which continued for a number of years afterwards. I don't know. That's about as best I can answer it, Chris.
Okay, no worries. This is one I'm definitely interested in hearing. Do you think that your experience of the events of 1968 had any impact on your scholarship on France?
Yes. Yes.
Could you
The sense of what I do in terms of the French Revolution is to do this dialectic between the provinces and the metropole. And that's a natural outgrowth of having done the counter-revolutionary project, but also the book on murder in the Midi. Definitely an exploration of the relationship between Paris and the metropole and how deeply Paris affects the provinces. I now think in relation to the academic side of that work, that Paris doesn't affect the provinces very much in the 1790s because it's too far away. The provinces have their own independence, as they've insisted. Especially the Aubagne book, which is about murder and revolution and counter-revolution in the Midi, where Marseille plays a huge role. Marseille is largely independent of Paris because Paris is 10 days travel away. It's a huge distance. No place on the planet these days is 10 days away from any other place. So it's kind of independence. But I ask that question all the time: what is the relationship between Paris and the provinces? And provinces are largely independent in the 1790s. And indeed, they can have an effect on the metropole too. No question about that.
And do you think your experience of 68 encouraged you to explore that more?
Oh, I think so. Precisely how is unclear. But having been in the provinces in May 68 was a unique perspective. I wasn't at the center of it in Paris, so a lot of my friends were, who had some very exciting stories to tell about their experience. Initially, anyway, my scholarship was that the provinces were a template on which Paris played, and that Paris wrote the script for the provinces. I think as my scholarship has gone on, that has changed enormously. The provinces are largely independent and have their own destiny and their own history. Very hard to uncover because the language in which things are described is very national. But what they mean by, say, counter-revolution is very different in places because it depends upon the nature of the pre-existing pre-revolutionary situation. So there is a history that Parisian events impact, and to uncover that society, which is not a blank, it's not a tabula rasa, is one of the important things that social historians can do for revolutionary France. Try to understand that and not be taken in by the commonality of language.
Okay, very good. More broadly in your career, do you think that your experience in 1968 had any bearing on what you went on to do, or was that going to happen anyway?
I tend to think that what I do has been accidental. That I discovered what I discovered accidentally. So the book on murder, called Murder in Aubagne, was, as I explained in the preface, entirely accidental. It had nothing to do with May 68 whatsoever. I was in the archives one day and discovered the trial records. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. It's a document that asks Napoleon to pardon murderers. And it's very persuasive at first until you dig behind the story and realize that these are really bad guys that are asking for a pardon, and they're not the innocents that they portray themselves to be. So that's how I discovered the project. How May 68 may have impacted that, hard to say. Not in any direct sense, no.
But even beyond your research and just into your work in the university milieu, that was all you were always going to go on that trajectory anyway, or?
Well, I remain suspicious of university administrators. Who don't necessarily have the best interests of the faculty and the students at heart. They are their own constituency. Ever growing constituency. Ever the monstrous growth that they are. So I remain suspicious of that, and I do think that at the University of Maryland we could benefit enormously from having a faculty union that would look after faculty interests, but we don't, and so that's the consequence of it. It's an administrative structure that bears down very hard on the rest of us, and so like that, it's a very complicated issue because the University of Maryland is so large that it has many constituencies, even among administrators. So that's another topic. But I would say, yeah, I think May 68 has reinforced my distrust of authority.
Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
I assume that as a person who experienced the events, is interested in France, and as a historian as well, that you've kept one eye on how the events of 1968 are portrayed in France. And I wondered if you had any opinion on whether or not the kind of dominant portrayal of 1968 sort of captures the reality of the experience.
The dominant portrayal being the student rebellion, would that be it?
Yeah,
Is that what you mean?
the fact that it's largely dominated by Paris students and May 68, and that's it.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a way of looking at it. I think that's fair enough. You're not wrong to talk about those terms, but you have to emphasize that working people had a big voice. In fact, it would never have had the impact that it had if there hadn't been the monumental general strikes that had occurred, the rolling strikes that had occurred, and that is certainly worth paying attention to. Had a huge impact also in French movies like Truffaut and Buñuel. Some of those movies are classics even now. Buñuel especially is very funny portrayal of the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. So it's had a big impact on French letters and intellectual life in general. Now I would say and then I haven't kept up on my reading about May 68, but I would say that it's certainly worthwhile digging into the provinces and trying to figure out what provincial issues were and how they relate. I'm sure it does relate because French provinces do have a life of their own, and people do have their own aspirations that are different than those of the metropole. But the way, so often, as you know, of course, French history is portrayed as the history of Paris and the history of upper classes. Even one of the books one of the best books on the French Revolution is called The Crowd of the French Revolution. Well, it's not the crowd of the French Revolution, it's the crowd in Paris in the Revolution. And it's about insurrections, it's not necessarily the crowd. So there is a Parisian-centeredness about writing French history. We all deplore and trying to figure out how to integrate the experience of the provinces into the master narrative.
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge that I'm trying to take on when it comes to 68. One last thing that I've asked everyone, if you were given 30 seconds to summarize your experience of 1968, how would you do it?
Wow. I would say that I was an observer in May 68. I was an observer in the provinces, in a city where not a lot happened, where some interesting things did happen, like the big demonstration of right-wingers and de Gaullists, which is against the master narrative of May 68, which sees the demonstrations as overwhelmingly left-wing and socialist in its aspirations, social democratic in its aspirations. The right-wing nature of the city then in those days was much more prominent than it is now. So I was a witness and observer in a place that has a different history.
Okay, that's great. Before I stop the recording, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, you said you were doing May 68. What are you doing?
Well, what are we doing with the material?
No, what's your research about?
May 68. Let me stop the recording.